The red and blue lights hit your rearview mirror out of nowhere. Your stomach drops before your brain even catches up. You glance at the speedometer, then at your hands on the wheel, suddenly aware of every tiny movement. The siren chirps once, sharp and deliberate. There's no doubt about it now, you're being pulled over. Your heart starts racing, and in that moment, every decision you make matters more than you realize. Have you ever been pulled over and felt like the officer was trying to get you to say something, anything, that could be used against you? If you have, I want you to drop your experience in the comments, because what we're about to go through is going to change how you think about that moment entirely. And there's something most drivers don't understand, something subtle but powerful, that I'll explain later, and once you see it, you won't unsee it. Let me tell you about a situation that, on the surface, looks like a driver outsmarting the police. But if you really understand what's happening underneath, it's less about tricking officers and more about understanding the system they operate in. This driver didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't speed off. He didn't do anything dramatic. What he did was far more effective, and honestly, far more dangerous if you don't fully understand why it worked. He set a trap, and the officers walked straight into it. Now, before you start thinking this is about playing games with police, let me be clear. Most people who try to outsmart an officer end up making things worse for themselves, fast. Because what they don't understand is that traffic stops are not casual conversations. They're structured, strategic interactions where officers are trained to observe, guide, and sometimes provoke responses. So what did this driver actually do? He understood timing, he understood silence, and most importantly, he understood how officers build probable cause during a stop. Let's rewind to the beginning of that stop. The driver pulls over promptly. That alone matters. Officers are already forming impressions before they even step out of their vehicle. A delayed stop? Suspicion. Sudden movements? Suspicion. Pulling into a dark area? Suspicion. Everything is being observed. So when this driver pulls over smoothly, turns on his interior light, places both hands visibly on the steering wheel, he's already controlling the tone of the interaction. Calm, predictable, non-threatening. The officer approaches. "Good evening. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Now, this is where most people make their first mistake. They answer, "I think I was speeding. I might have rolled through that stop sign. I didn't use my blinker back there." And just like that, they've handed over something valuable, an admission. Here's the thing most drivers don't realize. That question is not just casual conversation. It's investigative. The officer is giving you an opportunity to confirm their suspicion or even provide more evidence than they already have. But this driver didn't fall for that. He responded calmly, "No, officer." That's it. No guessing, no explaining, no volunteering information. Now here's where it gets interesting. The officer pauses. That pause is not accidental, it's pressure. Silence is one of the most effective tools in any interaction. People are uncomfortable with it. They rush to feel it. They start talking more than they should. But this driver didn't. And this is where the trap begins to form. Not because he's manipulating the officer, but because he's refusing to do what most people instinctively do. The officer continues. License, registration, and proof of insurance. The driver complies. No attitude, no delay. This is critical. Exercising your rights doesn't mean being difficult. In fact, the more cooperative you appear in your actions, the more noticeable your silence becomes. And that silence matters, because now the officer has to do more work. Let me explain something that most people overlook. Officers are trained to develop reasonable suspicion or probable cause through observation and interaction. That includes your words, your tone, your body language, even how quickly you respond. When you talk too much, you give them material. When you stay controlled and minimal, you limit that material. Now the officer tries a different angle. Where are you coming from tonight? Simple question, right? Harmless? Not really. This is what's called a fishing question. It's designed to open up a conversation that could lead somewhere. Maybe inconsistencies, maybe nervousness, maybe something that doesn't quite add up. Most drivers answer without thinking. Just coming from a friend's house, heading home from work, coming back from a bar, and sometimes those answers spiral into more questions. But this driver knew something. He didn't have to answer that question. So he said calmly, "I'm not answering any questions." Now pause for a second. This is where a lot of people go wrong when they try to copy this behavior. They say it with attitude. They say it defensively. They say it like they're challenging the officer. That's a mistake. Tone matters more than the words themselves. This driver stayed neutral, respectful, controlled, and that changes everything. The officer's demeanor shifts slightly, not aggressive but more focused, because now the usual conversational path isn't working. And here's the part people don't see coming. When an officer can't build a case through conversation, they often look for other ways. They observe more closely. They listen for inconsistencies in silence. They watch your hands, your breathing, your eye movement. They might repeat questions. Why don't you want to answer questions? Now this is psychological pressure. They're not asking for information anymore. They're probing your reasoning. And again, most people crack here. They start explaining. I just don't feel comfortable. I've heard I don't have to. I'm not trying to be difficult. And suddenly they're talking again. But this driver didn't take that bait. He simply repeated, I'm not answering questions. Same tone, same calm delivery, no escalation. Now here's where the perfect trap really takes shape, but not in the way people think. The officer returns to their vehicle, runs the license, checks for warrants, looks at the vehicle registration, all standard. But time passes, more time than usual. And this is where another common issue comes into play. Officers holding documents longer than necessary. Now, legally speaking, a traffic stop must be reasonably related in scope and duration to the reason for the stop. It can't be prolonged without additional justification. But here's the problem. Many drivers don't recognize when that line is being crossed. This driver did. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush, didn't escalate. He waited. Because timing matters. When the officer returned, the conversation shifted again. Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? There it is, the request. And this is where so many people make a critical mistake. They say yes. Not because they want to, but because they feel pressured. Because they think saying no makes them look guilty. Because they don't want to make things worse. But consent is everything in that moment. If you give it, you've essentially removed a layer of legal protection. This driver understood that, so he said calmly, I do not consent to any searches. Clear, direct, respectful. Now pay attention here because this is where the situation becomes very real. The officer pauses again, and then comes the subtle shift in tone. Step out of the vehicle. This is lawful. Officers can ask drivers to exit the vehicle during a stop. And this is another point where people get confused. They think refusing makes them stand their ground. It doesn't. It escalates the situation. This driver complied, slowly, carefully, no sudden movements, because understanding your rights also means understanding when to comply. Outside the vehicle, the pressure increases. More questions, more observation, sometimes even small talk designed to break your composure. But this driver stayed consistent, minimal responses, no volunteering. And here's where the trap fully closes, not because he tricked the officer, but because he left no room for unnecessary expansion of the stop. No admissions, no consent, no contradictions, just controlled, lawful behavior. Eventually, the officer has to make a decision, issue a ticket or let him go. Because without additional probable cause, there's a limit to how far the stop can go. And that's what most people misunderstand. They think the goal is to beat the officer. It's not. The goal is to avoid giving the officer more than what they already have. Now let's talk about the part people don't like to hear. This approach is not foolproof. It requires discipline. Because officers are human, they react to behavior. If your tone slips, if you sound sarcastic, irritated, or confrontational, you change the entire dynamic. And once that happens, everything becomes harder. You might be asked to wait longer. You might face more scrutiny. You might even unintentionally create reasonable suspicion through behavior alone. And then there's another layer, one that almost nobody talks about. Passengers. If you have passengers in the car, they can completely change the outcome. They might answer questions you refused. They might act nervous. They might contradict your story, even if you didn't tell one. Officers often shift attention to passengers when drivers remain silent. It's a strategic move, and it works more often than people realize. Then there's body language. People underestimate how much officers rely on it. Fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, overly rigid posture. These can all be interpreted in different ways. Not always accurately, but enough to influence the officer's perception. And perception drives decisions. Let's go back to that moment when the officer held onto the documents a little longer than expected. Most drivers don't question it. They sit there, unsure, maybe a little anxious. But legally, that's a critical phase. Because if the stop is extended without a valid reason, that becomes a different situation entirely. But, and this is important, you don't challenge that roadside. You don't argue law on the shoulder of the road. That's another mistake people make. They try to win the legal battle right there. That's not where it happens. The roadside is about control, composure, and avoiding escalation. The courtroom is where legal arguments belong. And here's the subtle truth behind that perfect trap. It wasn't about catching the officer doing something wrong. It was about not giving the officer anything extra to work with. No loose threads, no unnecessary risk, just patience and understanding. Most people think they're helping themselves by explaining, by talking, by trying to clear things up. But in reality, they're often building a bigger problem. Because once words are spoken, they can't be taken back. They can be interpreted, misheard, or used in ways you didn't expect. And that's why this kind of situation feels so tense. Because silence feels unnatural, compliance feels confusing, and the pressure to just say something is overwhelming. But when you understand what's actually happening during a stop, how officers think, what they're looking for, how they interpret behavior, you start to see why this approach worked. Not because it was clever, but because it was controlled. And control is rare during a traffic stop. So the next time you see those lights in your mirror and that familiar rush of adrenaline kicks in, ask yourself one simple question. Are you about to help your situation or accidentally make it worse without even realizing it? Because in that moment, it's not about being perfect, it's about being aware. And that awareness is what separates a routine stop from a situation that spirals into something much bigger than it ever needed to be.